follows is a talk given by Dr. Robert C. Beck at an informal gathering hosted by Paul Andrews and Diane Harbour. The subject of his discussion and dissertation is his recent development, the brain tuner.
Paul Tyler, who was at that time the chief of the Defense Nuclear Agency, Radiological Defense, usually picks me up at the airport in Washington and takes me back to the plane. And last February he said, "Bob, did you see the article in the January Omni magazine on Meg Patterson's magic black box?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, aren't you interested?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, while you're out in California at that time," he said, "why don't you look her up and see if there's anything we can do for her to get this thing broken loose and into the mainstream." Now, this was an honest effort by Paul Tyler, who attends all of these conferences, to be of assistance to Meg, because he was aware of the work that she had done with I4 Capel at the Curie Institute and a number of other workers. So when I got to Los Angeles, I gave her a call, introduced myself, said that the fellow who is in charge of this stuff for the Food and Drug Administration asks if he can extend any courtesy in helping you to get either type approval or what have you. She said, "Well, I cannot talk to anyone. I have contractual arrangement with the NET, Neuroelectric Therapy Group, and at that time they were near the John Wayne Airport, but under the circumstances we can call a meeting." Well, this was perhaps one of the most remarkable meetings I've ever attended in my entire life. At one end of the table was the principal investor, who at this time had raised about $3.5 million to develop the black box brain tuner, the neuroelectric therapy device. There were three of the staff scientists, and the president of the financial company, called TLC. Very bad analogy. It was, the middle word was leverage corporation. I think it was Turner Leverage Corporation or something. It had nothing to do with tender loving care. Meg had been brought to this country in August of 1981 to develop a device which had been built for her by Shackman Instruments in England, which was an outgrowth of the original Wen work. And I brought some of these instruments here in case we have any technical types to actually show you what they look like. The history of this is that Meg Patterson, while working as an abdominal surgeon at the Tongwa Hospital in Hong Kong, had come across Dr. Wen, W-E-N, and his use of electroacupuncture for anesthesia. And Dr. Wen had discovered, quite accidentally, that many of his patients were on heroin. At this time, 1970 to 72 in Hong Kong, a $500 a day habit in the United States would cost less than a pack of cigarettes in Hong Kong. And about 20% of the gross population that would go through the Tongwa Hospital in Hong Kong, Kowloon, were heroin addicts. So doing hundreds of surgeries a month, a certain percentage of these people who were heroin addicts began to report, "I'm not feeling any discomfort. I don't have withdrawal pains. I seem to have an altered state." They would go back on the street after surgery, get a fix from their usual mother, and find that the fix had not given them the same effect. There were a number of fights because they thought their heroin was being cut, etc. But it was a very interesting political situation. So Dr. Wen did what any cool scientist would do. He began doing rat studies. Now, mega rats. Right. I'll digress for a moment here and say that heroin, or opiates as a class, opium, morphine, heroin, and a number of the synthetics that are manufactured in the ethical pharmaceutical houses, simply overload the body's production of normal endorphins. Beta endorphin was discovered around 1975 as a painkiller that the body manufactures that is about 100 times as effective as morphine as a painkiller. When you don't have it, you get the aches and pains, the withdrawal, the stomach cramps, the nausea, the insomnia, all of these horrible things that attend withdrawal. When you give your body massive doses, or even small doses in the beginning, of any of the opiates, the part of the brain that says build neurotransmitters simply says shut down. We have too much. So when you get off of the substance, when you try to kick it cold turkey, the body is in agony because those little factories in the brain simply don't produce the endorphins. The word endorphin comes from endogenous, orphan after morphine. It simply means endogenous or built-in morphine. About 5 or 6 years ago, there were some 40 known neurotransmitters, serotonin being one of the most famous. At this time, there are over 2,000 that have been identified, and they're still counting. So the brain is an exceedingly complex little factory. Remember the days in school when they said, well, you're worth about $5. You've got 2 pounds of salt, some potassium, some carbon, some hydrogen. Try to buy a gram of interferon for under $8,000 or $10,000. The body is far more complex than this set of chemicals that we held so dear in grade school. What Dr. Wen did was to hook the rats on heroin, have 2 groups, one control and one active. He would cut off the heads of the rats and run chromatography, electrophoresis chromatography, to find out what some of these trace proteins were in the control and the sample. The rats who had been hooked on heroin and suddenly cut off, that were pretty miserable rats, showed that it took maybe a week to 3 weeks before the neurotransmitters would again reappear, the exact range of time that the withdrawal symptoms occupy somebody coming off of a narcotic. The rats, which were taken totally cold turkey off of heroin, which had been stimulated with 2 little clips, and I have the photographs of all this in the documentation, fascinating work, and were given electro-stimulation at around 111 hertz, and we'll talk about this later, showed that within 40 minutes of the time that the voltage was applied, the brain's ability to produce its own neurotransmitters had been rehabilitated, and that within 3 to 5 days it had reached normal. Now, the implications of this were rather stunning. How many people do we have in this country who are on Valium, Librium, uppers, downers, legal narcotics that are highly addictive? You probably remember that during the Civil War, American Civil War, when morphine was invented to replace some of the other opiates, they said, oh, here, we have a painkiller that's totally non-addictive. They've said this about almost every other drug that has seen the light of day. In fact, boys and girls, if it isn't addictive, they don't want to sell it. Did you realize that there's a $13.6 billion legal pharmaceutical trade in mood-altering drugs such as Valium and Librium, and that there is about a $20 billion market from the same drug manufacturers in the United States that export it to Mexico, where they do not have these tight pharmaceutical controls, prescription, which comes back onto the streets of the United States. That is close to $36 billion a year at the retail level. Now, nobody wants to interrupt this trade. Tobacco, which is 4.5 times more addictive than heroin. This study was done here at the Veterans Administration Hospital, Sepulveda, by Dr. Krover in 1974. It had been found that GIs coming back from Vietnam, who had several habits, tobacco, heroin, others, could be gotten off of heroin within 72 hours to a week, but it was almost impossible to get them off of tobacco. So a study was done which established that the withdrawal time on tobacco could run up to 2 years. that it was 4.5 times more physically addictive than heroin. This is hardcore scientific data. Would you like to see the American tobacco industry stop paying taxes? Their net is around $27 billion a year. Now, if we look at the liquor industry, where 90% of the drinking, the alcoholic consumption in dollar volume, is consumed by 10% of the drinking population, these are big dollars. People ask why these devices are not exactly legal in the United States. Well, getting back to the story, we came to this conference table hoping to exchange some information. I passed along to Meg and the rest of the people who must remain nameless, but this is thoroughly documented, the fact that Paul Tyler was willing to assist this group in getting this device going. Now, she had been in this country since August of 1981. They had raised $3.5 million to build a prototype. At the time that I met with these people in February of 1983, not one device had been built. We'll get to this very soon. So I asked them, how's your patent status? Well, we realize that once we patent it, we've given the secret away, so we plan on using the strategy of continuance in part, if you know what this means. In other words, they would continue to modify the patent as long as possible with continuations, amendments, so as not to get a patent. That meant that they had no patent. Well, what is the status of your prototype? Well, we are yama, yama, yama. Well, are you going to sell these devices? We don't know. We think we're going to lease them. Well, how much? Well, we'll put a price tag of about $50,000 on each box, and the doctor will be on the franchise agreement. I have a copy of this in case anyone doubts it. Required to charge the person $8,000 if he has no insurance for 10 days' use of the box. $10,000 if he has insurance coverage. I have the letter here that went to the franchisees. And yet they had no boxes. A number of people had bought territory for this, including William Parker of the Parker Holistic Health Center and a number of other people that by this time I had met. They had been promised delivery of the brain tuners by December of 1981. And here we are into 1983, and not one box had ever been delivered. Some strange things were happening here. And after listening to this for about an hour, I was prepared. I'd armed a briefcase. I had devices which I had acquired, had smuggled into the United States from the USSR, from Finland, from Germany, from England. I still have some of these. We have the original devices, I brought several of them tonight, that have been used by Dr. Wen in Hong Kong. In other words, the grandfather of the Shackman instrument device that Meg had used at the Pharmacon clinics in England. So it turned out that the investors who were at this table were not even aware that this technology was over 100 years old, had been used in the Soviet Union for over 20 years, had been used on the continent for 15, and in Great Britain for 10. They thought that they had an original idea which might have been patentable, etc. These devices could absolutely rock the boat of the pharmaceutical drug industry, the liquor industry, the tobacco industry, the doctors who make a great deal of money. When you want the prescription refill, usually you have to pay the doctor a fee. It's just a mess. Why are these not being used, for example, in alcoholic rehabilitation centers? I'll digress with another storyline, and all of this will converge in a moment. In 1969, some more friends of mine, new friends, I didn't meet these people until I started researching this area, had heard about the generic term electrosleep that was being used in the Soviet Union for addiction and alcohol control. The government gave these people a little money sent them to the Soviet Union, and they came back with one of the original devices that was used for, quote, electrosleep. It seemed that the Soviets had trouble with generals who drank too much vodka. And at this hospital in Washington, which is a household word, they were treating American generals who had the habit of too much Scotch bourbon or vodka or gin. They brought the device back to the United States in late 1969, early 1970, began using it in the hospital with addicts. This is thoroughly documented. It's one of the most fascinating psychopolitical stories that emerged during the 5 months that I was actually researching this data. The CIA came around and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, we have this electronic device, which apparently is restoring brain function in Korsakoff psychosis, which means loss of short-term memory." CIA said, "You can't do that." The people who were working on the project were dispersed, took the device to Garland, Texas, to the Vero Instrument Company. Now, Vero builds the high-technology equipment like Hughes does, the Glomar Explorer. Vero builds skunkwork devices like starlight scopes, infrared viewers, high-technology microcomputers. They're one of the highest-tech government secret agency suppliers in the world. The vice president of this company split off, founded a corporation called Neurosystems Incorporated, which is in the telephone book in Garland, Texas, and brought out a beautiful little device, which until recently was the Cadillac of the entire field, about the size of a pack of cigarettes, that absolutely cured addiction. They thought, wow, we're going to have markets for this. They never got FDA approval. It's been 14 years. FDA grandfathered them under Section 510K and B of the 1976 Congressional Act. They still said, hey, if we take this around to dry farms, namely alcoholic rehabilitation centers, there should be a tremendous need for these. Now, in California alone, there are about 24, Raleigh Hills, Schick, Seidel, CompCare. It's a big industry. He knocked on doors, and there was very little acceptance. Until finally, a fellow who had worked for one of these dry farms told him the secret. He said, you know, if somebody comes in here who has good insurance, we can run up about a $9,000 bill on laboratory tests alone, pathology, kidney tests, blood tests, you name it. He has to be in here for at least a week and a half to 14 days before we break even on our television advertising budget alone. We know that 75% of our business comes from recidivism. The person who gets glossed up, the family's happy, he goes back to work, will be back there. 75% of them will backslide within 6 months. You come in here with a device that will totally restore them in 5 days? Why, we are a franchise. We are here to make money for our stockholders. Get out of here, you bum. Now, fortunately, this company had spent a great deal of money in absolutely totally documenting the effects of this little device. They found that it reversed Korsakoff psychosis in 3 to 5 days with chronic alcoholics. This work was done at the University of Wisconsin Medical School, at the University of Louisiana Medical College, and at the University of Texas. Now, any of you who've dealt with alcoholism know that it normally takes 8 years for the short-term memory to be restored, 8 years of total abstinence. The short-term memory profile of an alcoholic absolutely pinpoints the amount of degeneration. One of the tests is the maze test, where you have to go through a maze without lifting the pencil from the paper. The other is the beta section of a test, where you have to look at words on one page. The page is taken away, and you have to remember it on subsequent pages. An alcoholic will usually show a profile of almost total inability to pass these two facets of this particular assay. In all of their subjects, I don't like to say all, it's rather spooky, 99% of them, they were able, where they had a baseline of tests, for example, when the person had been to college, had taken this same or a similar test, had become an alcoholic for 15 years, where they had access to the original records, the short-term memory was totally restored in 5 days of using this little box 40 minutes a day. Now, this is wild and wonderful. All of this emerged during some of the research. I spent quite a bit of time in the Biomed Library at UCLA, some time at the Norris Library, USC County, and some of the papers, particularly the work done in the Soviet Union and in the Orient, were only available at the National Medical Archives at Bethesda, Maryland. But I have compiled a bibliography. It isn't in the final form, and any of you who are health professionals can get a copy of it. I'm still trying to get it on the word processor, and there's an explosion of information in electromedicine lately, as anyone knows, and I try to update it, so every week my friends send me at least another dozen references on this particular topic. Now, it became apparent after spending a great deal of time with Meg that nothing was going to happen in this particular sector. She had her engineers come down to her little house on Fernleaf, and I spent many an afternoon with him explaining what I had found independently, explaining the difference between constant current and constant voltage, etc. The only device that Meg had brought to this country was the Pharmacon, which we were able to thoroughly instrument, analyze, and document. About the size of the original Sony Walkman tape recorder. And this is the device that was used on Peter Townshend when he was flown in on almost a hospital bed type airplane to the John Wayne Airport. He had taken a massive dose of heroin before he left London, enough to get him to the States. He was absolutely green and yellow when they took him off the plane, and Meg put this device on his head. And within about 40 minutes, of course, all of you have read this story. It's been reprinted in Penthouse. It's been reprinted in Omni magazine. He was rehabilitated after having spent a fortune in various clinics around the world. Peter Townshend finally got off, kicked the habit, and is now happy, healthy, clean, producing again. All of this is history. At any rate, they were getting results with the device, as primitive as it was. And it began to appear that the neuroelectric therapy group, the magnet group, either was not going to produce anything, they were either unable or unwilling to do it. Now, this could lead to a great deal of speculation as to who got to whom, whether the mafia was involved or some of the pharmaceutical houses or what have you. So I decided, well, let's research this thing a little bit further and bring out a box that will do some good, which I did. I gave away a number of these to friends and used them as guinea pigs. It worked. We feel it's vastly superior to the $50,000 Pharmacon device. But now, another very interesting thing happened. There had been an ongoing debate between Dr. Robert O. Becker, who was chief of orthopedic surgery at the Syracuse VA hospital, and a student of his, Dr. Andy Bassett, Columbia University, as to which frequencies would rehabilitate, rejuvenate, and grow limbs back on amputated mammals. How many of you are familiar with Robert O. Becker's work? Okay. Becker was using actually attached electrodes and putting current directly into the system. Now, he and I have shared several conferences in Canada over the years. He's a brilliant man. He's rather bitter. At one time, he'd been nominated for the Nobel Prize for his work, but because he was a little bit outspoken, like some of the rest of our family, he got to enjoy a rather early retirement. He was also speaking out on the fact that the power lines were causing undue clusters of illness here in the eastern United States. But he had a student named Andy Bassett who has made millions of dollars on a device which has been accepted by the orthopedic mainstream ethical physicians, a little magnetic paddle which is put near the non-union fracture which induces a current into that area by induction. Now here we have two separate approaches. We have a little ongoing discussion like Dr. Salk and Dr. Sabin. You can't get around either one of them without having him absolutely assassinate the other one, although both of them have a vaccine that works to a degree. This discussion became so heated that some funds were laundered and sent to Great Britain to find out just what was really going on. The results of this were reported for the first time publicly at a conference in Quebec last year by the principal investigator from Cambridge, a person of female persuasion, by the way, who finally located the secret frequency that was causing the tissue to rejuvenate. The mechanism by which this happened was that some of the blood cells, the basophils, in going to a site which had been slightly abraded, in the case of a rat, they would amputate an extremity, put the electrode, the blood seepage would undifferentiate, go to the area and start growing the tissue which had been there originally, as though there had been some type of an architectural pattern that had restored the memory of the RNA DNA close to the site to reproduce the proper tissue. It didn't turn into kidney tissue or brain tissue or testicles. It turned into whatever happened to have been there before the amputation. Now,
did that go down just to the joint?
No, they have had absolute, they've had, in human beings, young children, they have grown fingers back. If you follow this, it's an extremely delicate subject because they're not supposed to be doing this with human subjects. But when they get off the conference, they'll talk to you about what has actually been going on with this. Now, they ran many animal studies. They held the frequency constant and varied the waveform. They held the voltage constant and varied the frequency. They held the voltage and frequency constant and varied the pulse repetition rate. One of the three magic numbers was publicly disclosed at this conference a year ago last August in Canada. It was very much unsuspected. It was over 2 kilohertz. I can give it to this group, 2.72 kilohertz. When that particular frequency was in the shotgun effect of the device, the limb regrew. When it was filtered out, or when the slope of the curve was altered so that that frequency was not predominant, it didn't grow. Now, there are three other magic numbers which cause the rejuvenation, the healing, rapid restimulation of the neurotransmitters, and these were developed on another government grant program, and I'm not at liberty to tell you what they are, but they are in the little box that we built. We did very elaborate spectrum analysis work on all of the units that we could beg, borrow, or steal. These are computer printouts, spectrum analysis sheets of over 24 brain tuners, acuscopes, acustims, myomatics, the Great Wall device from China, the Shackman instrument device, the Pharmacon unit from England. We could go down the list on and on and on and on. We found that the majority of these devices were sort of hit or miss. They didn't have the magic numbers, but they had enough fairly rough harmonics. You know, it's so ridiculous for the people selling these devices to claim certain frequency effects. How many engineers do we have here? Well, you've played around with radio. Frequency is a useful term only if you're dealing with coherent waveforms, such as a sine wave. If you have a square wave, by definition, a square wave has an infinite number of odd harmonics, right? That's what a square wave is. So that means if you put a 10 hertz square wave into somebody, you have every other odd harmonic of that from DC to light if it passes the system. Is that correct? So here are people putting out square wave boxes that they say will tune from X number of hertz to X number of hertz, and they're looking at the pulse repetition rates and confusing them with the frequencies. Now, these are things that we find absolutely abhorrent. But since all these devices were copied from Tom Wing's Myomatic of many years ago, the spin-off of the Myomatic was the Ocuscope. The spin-off of the Ocuscope was the Ocustim. This apocrypha continues to repeat itself over and over in the trade. Well, we hope that in these years where more and more people are talking about electronic medicine, which has to be the medicine of the future, that some of these basic misconceptions will be clarified. Well, at any rate, 5 months after Paul had said, why don't you meet Meg and find out if there's anything we can do to speed this up? By the way, Meg's reason for not accepting the government's offer was that she wanted an entirely new category, and Paul had conveyed to her that if you will come in under the grandfather clause, get you approval by the FDA which will permit human and animal experimentation, and Meg absolutely totally refused to do this. She wanted a new category for neuroelectric therapy, not realizing that this category had been preempted by CES, which is cranial electrostimulation, and a long list of other generic terms. We tried to explain to Meg that since Reagan, there are only under 300 investigators still working for the Food and Drug Administration, and this is an accurate figure. There are over 80,000 devices awaiting their investigation and approval. If you have another $5 to $6 million and 10 years to wait, even if we get you at the front of the list, it's not going to fly. But she absolutely insisted that she would not come in under the grandfather clause for a TENS unit, which incidentally is how you people are legal, and the Acuscope is legal. Although these devices do a great deal more than any TENS unit, they cannot make claims for what they actually do, because this would put them in a new category. And this means human and animal tests, certification, all of this research that goes on and on and on and takes a tremendous amount of money. So we began experimenting in earnest. Thank God I had access to a IQS Model 401IL spectrum analyzer, which is probably the most advanced thing that I could get my hands on for under $50,000 for that Hewlett-Packard. And then we began looking at these frequencies in earnest. We eliminated the need for ever tuning the device. How many of you are familiar with the Acuscope? I'm going to use this as an example. Jerry Fisher, like the rest of us, realized that perhaps the most innocent people with whom you can deal are medical doctors. And here are these two dials that have various frequency settings. And the doctors very seldom read instructions. So Jerry came up with a marvelous idea. I got some different colored Scotch stick-on masking tape and cut little dots that are red and orange and green and yellow, and paste these dots on the dial. We can tell the doctor, match up the yellow dot with the yellow dot. And this made it almost idiot-proof. And so instead of talking specific frequencies, which is ridiculous when you're dealing with anything other than sine waves, you match the dots. And he would come back months later and find that the device was still set on the same dots as when he walked out of the office, and it was working fine, so everybody was happy. All of this apocrypha is now being replaced by hard science in these conferences. I've attended a number of them. It says electricity is the thing which makes you better, etc., etc. Well, at any rate, this was the political state of affairs in 1983, when a lot of people who did not know the difference between frequency and pulse repetition rate, and had never heard of heterodynes and harmonics, were looking for the Holy Grail. The way they normally did this, they would put the box on the dope addict, and they would just juggle a dial and say, how does this feel, how does this feel, how does this feel? It was a fairly empirical process. How many of you read the Omni article in January 73? Okay, 83, I'm sorry. You notice there that the main secret of making the person better was to twiddle the knob, because at that time they did not know what the frequencies were. It has been fairly well established that the beta endorphins are stimulated with a pulse repetition rate of between 90 and 111 hertz. The catecholamine at around 4 hertz, the enkephalin at another number, etc., etc. This work has been very well documented and very well replicated by a number of scientific laboratories. So what we decided to do in our box was to put all of these frequencies simultaneously. Now, some people said, well, shouldn't you do one and then another and then another? And it's turned out not to be this way at all. If you have a high Q circuit, you can put white noise into it and ring the filters, right? And the brain is an exceedingly high Q circuit. It appears to have a Q in certain of the neuronal constructs of around 3,000, which is amazingly high. Pardon me? The figure of merit. Q means the bandpass versus the energy required. A crystal set will get all the radio stations in the area at once. A superheterodyne or TRF will get narrower and narrower bandwidth. If you have a triple or double conversion superheterodyne, you can separate two stations that are within a kilohertz of each other. The difference between those is the Q of the circuit, which is tuning to the signal. The higher the Q, the lower the bandpass, the less the interference. So we developed a system. We broke the price barrier. Most of these things sold from $5,000 up. That had everything in it that was necessary for the brain to rehabilitate its own production of neurotransmitters. In the meantime, we had found about 200 pounds of literature, at least I have that many boxes full of Xerox material, that friends had sent me, literally cardboard cartons. My filing system is abysmal. I'm very creative. I just pile it in boxes and hope I can find it later. Of the work that had been done, absolutely establishing that any stress-related syndrome, and this is why the psychologists hate this device, the stress-related symptoms that are recognized are insomnia, addiction, anxiety, and depression. That about 95% of the people who use these devices for a period of less than a month find complete reversal of these, and here the psychologists had been talking to them for years at $50 to $75 an hour. The pharmacologists had been giving them mood-elevating, depressing, and altering drugs since the good old days of Milltown and into the more elaborate pharmacology. And here was a little box that, with a 98-cent transistor radio battery, would fix maybe 50 different people before the battery ran down and you had to replace it. That's about a half a cent a person. And so naturally, there was a great deal of resistance to this type of technology. So right now, there's this political hassle happening over the fact that even the Carnegie report, as you were the study back at the turn of the century, tried to damn all of the electronic medicine that had been proven back in the 1890s to be highly effective. And you know who funded those studies. It's very much like the American tobacco industry saying that the link between lung cancer and smoking, there isn't any. It's just... So we could go on and on about this. Basically, that's what the device is. That's how I started to do it. I hated to see people being charged $1,000 a day. And the thing just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. I'm sure there are a lot of specific questions here, and maybe a lot of other topics that we can discuss tonight. So what? Sure.
I need to turn that a little bit more. I just wasn't concerned about the absence of data regarding the device. I was also concerned about the absence of data, supposedly, about the actual results of using this on drug addicts.
Okay, the results of this in drug addicts were generated in the United States several years before Meg learned about the device in Hong Kong. And the vast literature on this was funded by the Neuro Systems Incorporated group in Garland, Texas. The studies were done with, how many of you have heard of the executive monkey study? Okay. This work was funded by the people who had brought this box out originally in 1970. This is before Dr. Wen had had his serendipity, his accidental discovery with the heroin addicts in Hong Kong. I didn't realize that you could give monkeys ulcers. But what they had done is to aggravate them enough to where they had ulcers, put the device on their acupuncture points. They found that within about 3 days they had reversed the pH of the acidity, and the monkeys got better, the control group. All of this work had been thoroughly done long before this current era of restimulation of interest. The rat studies had been done both in San Francisco and in Hong Kong. The chromatography had been done here in the United States, so it was well controlled. There is a wealth of information on this, and I'd be delighted to share the bibliography with you. Like electronic medicine, when we were looking at patents, we found a patent in 1893 showing a fellow with electrodes behind his ears. Did I show you that, Paul? Okay. 1893, before the Harrison Act, some 20-some years before the Harrison Act, you could go into any drugstore and buy morphine sulfate. Mothers whose babies cried could buy simple soothing syrup, which was sugar and morphine. She'd give a teaspoon to the baby, and the baby wouldn't cry anymore. There were quite a few addicts. The stuff was legal. There was no control. I mean, marijuana was legal. All the good stuff was legal. And after the act, a number of people who were trying to get off this had forgotten that around 1890 we had a hell of a lot more addicts in this country. The women who were religious were sipping tonic, which was about 200 proof alcohol for their health, taking bitters and what have you. In other words, we had about the same addiction level, and this work had been explored about 84, 85 years ago, and then again suppressed by what we feel is the ruling class of the doctors, the pharmacies, and the people who want to take your money for making you better. So, if you're interested, we have this vast literature. We have a bibliography. We have a patent list. Fisher, no relation to Jerry, had done this work in 1932 and 35 and had a number of patents. Remember the Fisher Instrument Company that was making electrical stimulating devices back there 40 years ago or so? Okay, this has been in the literature. They had explored in great depth the waveforms, the frequencies, the application modes, and what happened. I'm not allowing many questions. Why don't we...
Bob, I'm interested in finding out if there are any frequencies that have been identified that would produce a spiritual or mystical experience.
Yes, there definitely have been. A number of us have replicated the work a number of others have replicated the work I did in 1973. In 1969, I began building ethical biofeedback equipment, EEG brainwave amplifiers. And I had one foot on each banana peel. I had been a scientist. I'm now a kook. So we sort of straddle this chasm. So I have taught biofeedback at classes at UCLA, USC, Villanova, University of Hawaii, SMU. And when I was doing this for health professionals, I also had access to the psychic underground. In Hawaii, I was able to make brainwave recordings of one of the 3 living bloodline Polynesian kahunas, Morna Simeona. There's Sam Lono, Morna Simeona, and another fellow on the main island, and then there are all these thousands of pretenders, the Daddy Bray, Gordon. I'd rather not go into that. I was able to make brainwave EEG recordings of Hexenmeisters, like John Ott in Lancaster County, no relation to the fellow who did the work on light and color. I have worked with American Indian medicine men. I've worked Catherine Kuhlman, before she died, let me run a little telemetry test when she was knocking him down at the Shrine Auditorium. We found almost invariably that when they were in their working state, which was only a few seconds, you don't need it. You're here, you get the information, you come back, you can talk about it for hours. It's a flash in the twinkling of an eye. They were showing about a 7.83 hertz, almost pure coherent, maybe 20 microvolt signal frontal to occipital midline. That's between F1, F2 in the standard nomenclature system to halfway between O1, O2 if you're an encephalographer. In other words, the third eye to the inion, which shows whole brain alpha. And over again, we found these frequencies in people with remarkable talents: healers, radionics operators, dowsers, shamans, witch doctors, mystics, Golden Dawn, priests and priestesses, if they were authentic. One of our early cases was, well, I'd better not mention the person's name. It's a world-famous name. But at any rate, I was intrigued enough with this that if this were the common denominator, and yet none of these persons would speak to the others, Catherine Kuhlman thought it was the blood of the Lamb, that Christ has died for your sins, and that's the only way to go. And some of the American Indian medicine men thought it was in the sacred cornmeal, the gourds and the feathers, and Morna Simeona had certain stones that were the dwelling place of the ancestral spirits. Well, Catherine would think that was heathen, and Morna would absolutely laugh at a fellow in a barn in Lancaster County wearing a black hat between midnight and dawn, drawing these hexagonal figures, hexensiegels, to bless the barns. None of these people would speak to one another, but they were all showing the same signature. Now, the amazing thing about this is that 7.8 hertz is the mean median mode frequency of the Schumann resonance, or the Earth ionosphere cavity resonance, this little magnetic signal that's been dubbed the Earth's brainwave. So after we'd seen it enough times, I developed very sensitive magnetometers, which I sell to the government for anti-submarine warfare, that would detect this Earth ionosphere cavity resonance, and in a few cases, not enough to make a solid scientific case, but enough to be extremely interesting anecdotally, we found that there was phase lock, both frequency, amplitude, etc., between that person's EEG signature and the Earth's brainwave itself. Now, this was heresy when I reported on it in 1973 and then did a more formal paper in 77. It means that some people with remarkable talents, maybe 1 in 1,000, are sensitive enough to tune to this cosmic clock. When they synchronize their brainwave with this signal, they can access information in the hologram, which is normally not accessible except in an altered state of consciousness. If we take a hologram with helium-neon laser light, which happens to be 632.8 nanometers, and try to play that hologram back with a carbon dioxide laser or anything else, we get garbage. That hologram, at least in the old-fashioned system, not the dichromates, must be played back at that specific wavelength of light. If it doesn't, you garble the image. The analogy here would be that if the holographic mind, which was very hot several years ago as a topic of conversation, is true, David Bohm, of course, this is his theory, and Carl Pribram thought it was a good idea and got on board. It is now fairly certain that the mind is a hologram. It acts holographically. If you cut a picture in half and throw half of it away, you've lost half the data. But if you cut half of your brain out, like we had a number of hydrocephalies that had a brain about the size of a grape, and we had veterans coming back from Korea, Vietnam, etc., World War I and II, that had 90% of their brain missing, they hadn't forgotten 90% of their family. They had remembered every single person. It wasn't as though you had thrown half of the information away. So that suggested that the brain was processing information like a hologram. If you break that hologram into smaller and smaller pieces, you still have the whole picture, but in less detail. But you can't see that picture unless you have that specific excitation frequency of, in the case of helium-neon, which is the most common, replays that information. So as a metaphor only, if the person has, by dint of meditation, religious practice, taking sacred mushrooms, or whatever the person does, managed to hit that particular frequency in his brainwave pattern, it seems to make him more amenable to all of this information. Now, this is interesting because if our mind is a hologram, and if you and you and you are existing right here, right now, you're part of it. Which means that if you can access what's in your mind, quantum physics says there's no reason why you can't access the whole thing. Thou art that. You are in the universe is in you. You are God. whatever information is out there, you have just a little bitty slice of it. It isn't as short, it isn't as high a resolution as if you were everybody all at the same time. But you can do it, as any shaman or a person who's undergone any kind of mystical discipline, or the Monroe Institute, can demonstrate. In spite of all of the John Wheelers and Randy the Magician types to the contrary. So what that means to us is that maybe that magic number, 7.83 hertz, is the place on the alpha-theta border. Alpha is from 8 to about, they used to say 14. We now say 12.5 because there's a kappa in the gap. Theta is usually considered to be 4 to 7. So 8, or 7.83, is right there on that biphasic border between the alpha-theta. We've known for years that theta might be the area where we access creativity. You recall that Thomas Edison, Bernard Baruch, many people would take a little cat nap when they were dealing with a particularly knotty problem. They would say, I will have the answer when I wake up, and usually they would. Well, the reason for that didn't emerge till many, many years after the death of these people who had been using this technique. A number of us use it today. When it was demonstrated that when you go to sleep, the hypnagogic state going from waking to sleeping, the hypnopompic coming up from sleep to normal consciousness, you pass through that alpha-theta border. And that might be the place where you access the information external to your own nervous system. Now, you can get an argument on this, but great ideas down through history, from the invention of the calculus to inventions of many other things, have appeared simultaneously at places all over the planet. So that means that maybe Rupert Sheldrake is right, that there is a morphogenetic field, and that maybe this is the best way to access this. Now, getting back to your specific inquiry, this state can be stimulated with small magnetic oscillators. I brought this one. It was brought in from Germany. This is the Vitaset unit that many of the important people in Germany have to wear because it resynchronizes the left and right hemisphere firing with this little magnetic pace setter when they're feeling particularly distressed because they're closer to the Eastern Iron Curtain transmitters than we are. It's been found that these very small, this has been done by Delgado, who had to leave the University of New Mexico and go to Spain because his work was so controversial. It's been done by Ross Adey at the Pettis VA hospital out here in Loma Linda. It has been replicated by any number of people, both in the open literature and in the intelligence community, as a fact. Your brain can be stimulated to go into these particular states. And of course, Bob Monroe has another system which is highly viable, which I admire. Paul can tell you a lot about that. So instead of its being witchcraft, this is emerging as the medicine, the consciousness of the future. Instead of dropping acid to alter consciousness, there are far more benign ways. You had a question, buddy?
What are slot implications? Are there any? What are slot implications?
Well, I would say that science and religion are on a collision course if they haven't collided a long time ago. I would say that we now have scientific proof that man, as a biocosmic resonator, is tremendously sensitive to these very small stimuli. 3,500 papers on this topic in the hardcore scientific literature. Now, if you choose to challenge me on that figure, I will take you 10 to 1 in a bet. Now this, it's an absolute explosion. Right, it's an explosion of information. Years ago, we were a piece of meat. Today, we're a finely tuned instrument that can access information exterior to ourselves and do something with it, bring it back. I'm told about a time when Bob Monroe gave a demonstration for the CIA, and he was challenged to leave his buddy. This happened in Maryland, if I got the story straight, from the Naval Office of Surface Weaponry that sponsored it. That's the Skunk Works back there, White Oaks, Maryland. Bob actually went to the distant site, got into the safe, read the data, and came back. It was later verified on a double-blind test Half the people in that room got up and said, gee, that's interesting. I wonder how he did it. It has to be some kind of a trick, and then went unconscious about it later. They could not, their reality structure could not admit that, damn it, the Soviets have been doing this for a long time, and there's some people over here that are on top of it. It's the challenge to your belief structure that stumps. Well, we could go on that forever. What are the implications of this? That we have new technology for enhancing consciousness rapidly, safely, right now, with no side effects, that works for at least 30% of the population. The brain tuners work for about 95%, the magnetic stimulation for only about a third. So that is by no means perfected.
So you have two devices essentially that you've been talking about. One is
I have maybe 100 that I've been talking about.
Well, you have something in your pocket.
There are two different approaches to healing. Robert O. Becker puts electrodes on the limb. Dr. Andy Bassett puts a little magnetic paddle. Both of these things work.
You have something for sale for just a couple $100.
Yes, I do have, but this isn't basically a sales meeting.
Right. What is that device? And what does it do?
Well, here's what they look like. And that device is absolutely guaranteed to outperform things that sell from $5,000 to $10,000. We guarantee it. We give 100% money-back guarantee, and that's called a brain tuner. Yes, this goes behind the ears. You might want to know how this happened. Traditionally, the point for stimulation for electroacupuncture for certain types of surgery are point 86, which is in the concha of the ear. It's called the heart-lung point. In classical acupuncture. Dr. Wen was inserting number 30 needles. I think it was 0.3 of a millimeter beneath the surface of the skin at a 30-degree angle, and he was putting alligator, this is all in the open literature, putting alligator clips to these needles. Meg Patterson found a spot on the mastoid process right up here at the top of the ear, using external electrodes, not penetrating the skin, no blood and guts, that was just as effective. The neurosystems people, in doing a study, found that by far the most effective spot is this little hollow behind the TMJ, the temporal mandibular joint. This accesses various acupuncture points on what's called the triple warmer, Yo-Shin 2-1. How many acupuncturists do we have here? Or people who are familiar? Okay. All right. But at any rate, this has been researched for about 20 years, and it works. It works every time. And so far, we've only had 3 units returned to us in over a year. And these were by people who tried to take them apart to build their own, and they tried to dig into the stuff and sent them back because they couldn't do it. The people who used them, yeah?
Can I say something about
Sure.
I have a friend who's part of my group, and he works in the movie industry. And he has a friend who's been on cocaine for 11 years. And so I said, I have a device that he may want to try if he's truly interested in getting off of it. And he said, well, all right. He said, I'll try it. So he took it down to the movie lot. The guy's been trying it now this is his 6th day. He's off of cocaine, and he's thoroughly delighted. So now everybody else on the movie set, of which a number of people you can imagine use drugs, are extremely interested in it. And so that's been my experience with it so far.
This and yours, did you have specific frequencies here and that as general?
We have all of them simultaneously. This generates a sine wave at 10 hertz at millivolts, and it requires about 25 volts minimum threshold to stimulate the endorphins.
When you say you have all of them, roughly how many do you have?
200. Would you like to see the spectrum analysis of this?
I wouldn't understand it.
Okay. We put them in bundles. We think that some physiology, for example, an old person and a young person might have slightly different frequencies. So when we're hitting the beta endorphin, we center it for example, if this is the target frequency, we put out enough on each side of it in these 3 magic ranges, enkephalin, catecholamine, and beta-endorphin. These seem to be the most active known neurotransmitters. So that we have bracketed this. We've used a bit of a shotgun instead of a rifle. When we work the lower frequencies for the catecholamine, each one of these clusters shows the simultaneous frequency spectrum by fast Fourier transform each millisecond, each 1,000th of a second. This bundle of energy is supplied to the points. Now, it was rather difficult to do that because we had to, by reverse Fourier transform, find out what fundamentals would recombine and heterodyne to give us exactly the spectrum that we want. If you hold a prism to the light and you have white light, you can separate that into red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. You can recombine those with three basic colors in the additive system to get white, but you have gaps in it. If you look at that with a spectroscope, if you look at a fluorescent lamp, you'll find it's not a continuous spectrum.
Give me a little electromedicine for little folks.
Okay.
As in a therapeutic entity, as you correctly pointed out, if you have something that has physiological activity, it probably has side effect also. That, for something like this, what is the effect that it has on the human instrument, and what, if any, are the potential dangers?
The most troublesome side effect that has been noted almost universally is that it stimulates lucid dreaming. And some people who've been shut off from their dreams are a little alarmed when they're dreaming again. Have you experienced this, Gail? Yeah, okay, Paul has been on the box, and his friends.
I had to quit using it because my dreams had become so lucid and so vivid and so persistent that it became a little bit of a...
This box, Paul?
Yes. But, I mean, it wasn't to the point where it was irritating. I mean, if you're looking for that spectrum, I mean, it's very beneficial.
By the way, those electrodes have to be very, very wet before they work. Are they moist? You have to soak them in salt water the first time you get them. After that, you put them in tap water and about once a month in salt water.
I felt a stink when I turned it on. Is that a normal feeling?
Well, you can notice a sting if you don't clean. See, there's 7 layers. There's the oil. Right now, I took a bath before I came here, but I feel a little oil on my skin. There's the squamous epithelium. There's the subcutaneous... It's a matter of contact. And if you clean that area with a little swab with alcohol and get good contact, there is no sting. It's a very pleasant sort of buzzing stimulation.
How precise is the area that you have to have contact with?
In classical acupuncture, the needle has to go in within 1/10 of a millimeter of the desired site. With electroacupuncture, anywhere between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch will still hit it because the current is diffuse. The electrons, being of like charge, will disperse through the body. So anywhere near that is effective.
I, to my knowledge, don't have any major addictions. As a relatively normal animal, what would I expect to gain?
You'll notice this is another one of the startling side effects. My own lady had a spinal block when her daughter, who's 25 years old, was born. Since that time, she could not remember telephone numbers, addresses very well. She found after she'd been on it for one day that she was recalling telephone numbers, did not need the telephone book, and numbers that she had known 20 years earlier when she'd worked in aerospace were coming back. You'll find that you can recall faces and places that you thought you had lost. They're just there. It does amazing things to the memory. It is a specific for stress reduction. If you have any type of anxiety, depression, insomnia, if it's chronic, it takes about 3 weeks. This is a universal constant that has been replicated in any number of studies. If it's acute, it takes about a week. Chronic is something that's been bugging you since you were 5 years old. Acute is your dog got run over, your wife left you, and you lost your job all in the same day. That takes about a week.
Are you planning any further FDA contact to set up clinical trials?
I have been offered. They all want to go in business with me, so they say they can give me clearance if I want it, but I don't want to go in business with them.
They mean
Paul Tyler, Floyd Weston, yeah, very highly placed. Senator Burt Bye,
Why wouldn't you want to go into business with it?
If this device is approved by the Food and Drug Administration, it will have to have a little label on it that says it is illegal to use, transport, sell, etc. this device without a medical prescription. It will have to go up to about $575, which is the base price on the NLS device. The public cannot access it. They'll have to go to some damn medical doctor and get a prescription for it. TENS units, StimTech, for example, $500 or $600. Costs them about $5 to build, but the doctors say that unless it costs about $500, it isn't medicine. It will be another ripoff. If it is approved by the Food and Drug Administration, it will not be accessible by the people who want it except at a very high price.
Is there any threshold on having your neurotransmitters stimulated? Is there a degree where it's...
Yes, the plateau... Okay, the dosage, all of the plateaus have been noticed by most of the workers at between 20 and 30 minutes. 40 minutes is red line. If you go 45 minutes, they begin coming down the other side of the slope. It won't do any damage, but you will undo the benefits. So we recommend that the device be used for only about 20 to 30 minutes a day. If you have a basket case like Peter Townshend, Meg put the thing on him 24 hours a day for the first several days. We think that's overdoing it. That's overkill. Too much medicine is worse than not enough. So in the case of an alcoholic who's into DTs, bedridden, throwing up, really in bad shape, we say 2 sessions, 40 minutes in the morning, 40 minutes at night a day. When the person is more or less back together, we say then cut that back down to 40 minutes once a day. That seems to be enough. It's an on-off and amplitude. You turn it up to the point where it's basically uncomfortable, then turn it down to where it's comfortable. In about 10 minutes, you'll find that you will acclimate, and you'll have to turn it higher and higher. Your body builds up a tolerance to it.
Is there a right or left? Is there a right or left to it?
No, there isn't. It's a biphasic, pure AC. Now, if you're feeling it more on one side than the other, do this. Keep your...
Interestingly, the first one I had a slight steam. I get no sensation from this one at all.
That's the dry one.
Well, you have to dip those.
You have to dip it in the salt water.
Most people will feel a difference in stimulus on one side or the other, and to prove that it's you and not the instrument, simply turn your head all the way one way and all the way another, and you'll find that the locus will shift. And what you're getting there is an algebraic sum and difference of the myographic, the myoelectric, the muscle tension, plus or minus the AC coming in on the electrodes.
Is that acclimation factor each time you use the instrument?
Generally, if you've been off of it for an hour or two, then it has to redo. You want to wet those, Paul? And
Yeah, I will.
Is it possible after getting rid of an addiction you could become addicted to it?
No.
But it makes you feel so good.
We've had a problem with a few alcoholics who we've gotten off, say, a fifth of scotch a day, and they feel so great that they're panicked, and they'll go back and drink 2/5 to get the same effect that they would on one. We believe that this is the death wish, and since God gave those people free will and they've chosen to anesthetize themselves, that's their choice. But if they want to kick whatever it is, it works. It only works about 45% effectively with tobacco. With Dr. Elizabeth Long's work with heroin, morphine, it's been about 95%. With Valium and Librium, about 95%. The only thing that we can't kick almost instantly is tobacco. That's the most addictive substance known to man.
Who's Dr. Elizabeth Long?
She works with Valerie Hunt and has a practice in the Hollywood area.
She has used this to cure addiction.
Oh, yes. Oh, many doctors have. The history of this is that some doctor will buy 1 unit and pass it around, and then the next order will be for 3 or 4, the next will be for 10, the next one will be for a couple of dozen. So it's a thoroughly tested, viable approach. There's no placebo, witchcraft, maybe in it. The animal studies have proven that. It works.
How does this differ from using acupuncture to cure addiction?
Oh, God. I wish we had an acupuncturist here. It's rapid and it works very effectively, and it doesn't require a doctor with a license to penetrate your skin. Dr. Hunt has been working with people with dyslexia, and she finds that she can resynchronize their left and right hemisphere to the point that for a short while after exposure on some of these devices, the delay lines, if you flash a strobe light at the closed eyes of a child with dyslexia and measure the evoked potential, the photic stimulus that is taken off of the occipital, you'll find that the signal will arrive from this eye at a different time than it will from this. You can see this on an oscilloscope, which means that the optic nerve is not processing that data coherently. But if you put something there that will reset the firing of those neurons so that they're all marching to the sound of the same drummer, the person can read for a while after that exposure without palming, without going through the usual strategies of a person who is unsynchronized. So you can call it a brainwave synchronizer, you can call it a gobbledygook. If it's working, don't fix it.
Have you used this on the other end of human performance, athletes, and improving athletic performance?
Talk to him about this. I think they've got a vast amount of experience. What they did find in the student study at the University of Louisiana, again, this is accessible in the literature, is that they were working on students who had anxiety about final exams. I know, I've been there. Years ago, fortunately. And after they had removed the anxiety, or the freezing, their IQs went up. So the story was spread around for a while that these things improved intelligence. But it turned out that that isn't what was happening. What had happened is that they had restored these persons' memory. Apparently, they were then able to access the information in a shorter period of time, and since IQ tests are graded against a clock, they were getting higher scores. So it wasn't intelligence, it was simply memory that had been rehabilitated. And this was controversial from about 72 to 74. There were all these arguments in the literature about why was this person performing better, and the final solution was simply that the memory had been restored. In other words, apparently when the brain is tuned, the neurotransmitters are in balance. If you've ever tried to get any continuity with a heroin user, their attention span is less than that of a hamster in heat. Maybe because the... Okay, what's...
I have a question for you. Maybe it's the devices that I've been exposed to, but it seems that no matter what frequency we've observed, there's a wide variety of reactions. And I don't know if it's the electronic devices or exactly what happens when you input a frequency into someone's body, or their brain, how they interact with what's going on inside. I've had a hard time with this, where if you dial 8 hertz on a device, will people just automatically go into 8 hertz? Because I've seen all sorts of different reactions.
Well, that's a very complex question. In the first place, you cannot run an EEG trace at the same time that you're putting stimulus in, because the EEG is only about 10 microvolts, and the stimulus is orders of magnitude stronger, and what you're reading is the device, not the brainwave. In the second place, the devices with which you're familiar don't put out 8 hertz. They put out an 8 hertz pulse repetition rate, which contains an infinite number of odd harmonics because it's not a sine wave, it's a square wave. So what you're doing is very loose. And let's talk about that later. What you have to do is to take a spectrum analyzer, as we've done here, and then find out what the actual fundamental frequencies are that reconstruct your target frequency. You have to look at the other end of the telescope.
Okay, but the point I'm trying to arrive at, okay, let's say with your device, if you were to dial a certain frequency, it didn't have...
You don't. That has amplitude only. We set the frequencies at the factory so nobody can mess with them.
Okay. Are you saying that somebody would, I don't want to use the word be forced to go there, but would that place someone in a theta state or an alpha state or something like that?
Not necessarily. It simply addresses the stress-related symptoms of depression, anxiety, insomnia, or addiction, hypertension, you name it. You see, 80% of the hospital beds in this country, maybe 100, are occupied with people who have psychosomatic ailments, and most of these are now traceable to stress, period. When you relieve the stress, you're going to reverse that condition. There was a time when they thought that maybe there were one or two diseases that had no stress-related syndromes like cancer or what have you. Now, of course, it's been shown that there are vast psychosomatic factors in even that. So the point is, you can hardly name any existing condition that is not stress-related. The body itself has a marvelous ability to heal itself if it has the proper things to work with. And if you relink that body with some of its normalized neurotransmitters, they apparently work faster than anything else to normalize the body.
Well, I had a question.
Yeah.
If I were to buy one of these, would I have to worry about, like, going through airports as far as the X-ray units they use?
No. Just tell them that it's an alignment device for your tape recorder head. Tell them anything.
Well, I mean, if it were working with those scanners, would that radiation damage the unit?
Oh, no, absolutely not.
Or white sound.
Yeah.
You can have it hand inspected anyway.
Sure.
Hand it over to
There's so many Walkmans and portable radios and what have you, and they can X-ray that and see that there isn't a gun or a bomb inside, and you're okay.
So there's nothing X-ray sensitive inside?
Oh, absolutely not.
Bob, do you use either of these devices on a regular basis?
Oh, absolutely.
Which one do you use?
I use this maybe once a week. I have to work some days 14, 18 hours, and I'm not as young as I used to be. And this, well, I can do about twice as much in half the time. My memory is better than it was 20 years ago. I sleep better. I have a lot of energy.
Use like what, maybe a half hour or an hour once a week?
20 minutes or so.
So about 20 minutes a week does it for you.
Yeah. Normally, you would not use this after, say, a month. Again, if anyone is interested here, there is just such a vast literature on it that it's an insult to your intelligence to just give you an overview without actually documenting it. But if you are interested, I can give you any number of references that address that specifically. Dr. Ray Smith, who's the Chief of Research and Development for Neurosystems, carries a unit. I saw him just last week. We spent 5 or 6 hours together. He uses his about once or twice a month, whenever he feels particularly hassled or tax time or whatever. This lets him get the job done. And normally people build up so much resistance to a job or what have you that they cripple themselves.
Bob, do you think this has application for anxiety, depression, that sort of thing?
Well, that's what I've been talking about all night.
Well,
Yeah,
I wanted to get a
specifically.
little more specific.
Right. Lithium carbonate requires blood assays. The dosage is fairly critical. In most of the studies, again, double-blind, a most amazing thing happened in some of these studies. The doctors who had done them, and one or two of these that I have from the University of Wisconsin, said that we hope our colleagues check our results. We can't imagine anything being this effective, and yet we've gone over our studies repeatedly. And to have a responsible scientist put that in his report as sort of a disclaimer, I found rather titillating. And yes, it does specifically address stress-related symptoms, and at the top of that list are anxiety and depression. And we don't know of anyone who doesn't have a taste of these, no matter how well balanced, how well adjusted, how high on pot or low on Valium, Librium, or what have you that they get to be. Well, I guess that's it, or let's talk about something else.
I asked a question a while back about to enhance physical or athletic prowess.
I passed that on.
You passed that on.
Apparently a number of these devices, like the AccuStim and AccuScope, are being used in sports medicine. But they're basically being used to relieve pain. TENS units have been around for about 100 years. When Norm Shealy saw the little device from the barber shop that had an induction coil and a flashlight battery in the handle that you rolled up and down your back, he thought this was a good idea and brought out one of the first transistorized TENS units. By the way, there's an interesting story. The StemTech company was purchased by Johnson & Johnson. I'm sure you're aware of the litigation that came down. And a few years ago, the president of StemTech took Johnson & Johnson, which is one of the largest pill manufacturers in the United States. They make Tylenol, Super Tylenol, and what have you, and hundreds of other products. They took him to court saying that you have suppressed this technology. They won. The judge said, in 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a more flagrant violation of trust. This is in the, this was reported in a number of magazine articles. Johnson & Johnson appealed the $130 million judgment against Johnson & Johnson, lost the appeal. The inventors of the StemTech, which is only one of maybe 20 or 30 TENS units, then got back in motion. The judge pointed out that it wasn't to the advantage of Johnson & Johnson to have anything that relieved pain if they were in the business of selling Tylenol. So that's a matter of public record that the drug companies try to suppress this type of technology. That was a pretty big lawsuit. Made a lot of headlines. That's typical. You see, we're not dealing with the scientific problem with this type of instrumentation. We're dealing with a socio-political, economic problem. The government, on one hand, subsidizes the tobacco growers, and on the other hand, says you have to put a warning on the packages, But the tax growers generate so much, rather the tobacco growers generate so much tax revenue that they're in this double bind. This thing it's a political problem, not a scientific one. The same thing is happening with the new emerging electronic medical devices. Germany has some of the most amazing things, the Mora unit, you're familiar with that, the Dermatron. These things do almost psychic diagnostic work, and yet they're totally outlawed in this country. You have to, like Andreas has to smuggle these things in. Call them agricultural testing devices. We've had one complaint from a number of professional users. They say, for God's sake, take that little thing and put it in a great big box, put a lot of dials and bells and whistles and light-emitting diodes and switches on it, all of which would be dummy, incidentally, and charge $5,000 or $6,000 for it, and then people will have faith in it. And I say, well, that's criminal. But anyway, that's my philosophy. Yeah, go.
You just touched on using it for pain relief before. Could you say something more about that?
Yeah, it's a superb TENS unit. I was going to lunch with Paul at the Ambassador a couple of weeks ago, and I tripped over one of these, very embarrassing, one of these tire puncturing things, and having had about 10 years of judo, I slapped as I was going on the cement, and I broke, I don't know whether I broke the bone, but this was extremely painful. I couldn't even move it. And I thought, holy cow, what's the matter with me? So I got this device, put it on this area, and the next day I had full motility and no pain.
That was what device?
This one right here, the brain tuner.
You put it on your hand?
Yeah, I took the electrodes, wet them, and just held them here for about 10 minutes. So it's a superb TENS unit, transcutaneous electric nerve stimulator, but we don't sell it for that purpose. Meg Patterson, when I first met her, was wearing her brain tuner on her back. She had a low back pain, and at this first meeting, she had 2 electrodes taped to her back, and she had this one Pharmacon unit in her belt. So they will work either way. But you cannot use a TENS unit for a brain tuner because there's a DC offset voltage built in deliberately. Any DC above the neck causes small synaptic polarization, like electrolysis. Do not use a TENS unit as a brain tuner, but you can use a brain tuner for a TENS unit. All hens are chickens, not all chickens are hens. Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
About experiential stuff. Then there was this thing, tuner on me, and a slight buzzing in both ears.
All right.
Pleasant. And I have a whole left hemisphere vibration going on. Almost nothing over here.
Turn your head and see if it shifts. The feeling behind the ear, for starters.
That's pretty well balanced.
At this point, someone asked Bob a question about the relationship between electronics and expanded states of consciousness. And he replies,
People have done this. Hundreds of people have done this that you're talking about. And the way you do it is you expose yourself to nonlinear orthogonal magnetic fields, and it does trigger this frequency in your brain, and you do have the paranormal results. But it's slightly artificial. We'd rather you learn to do it through EEG biofeedback instead of having it done to you. But where I teach classes back east occasionally where they have a number of people who have to get into this state very rapidly. And Bob Monroe, of course, has dealt with this same part of the community, and we can do it in one weekend using all of the artificial props. And Paul can tell you a great deal about that, I'm sure.
What's the duration of the effect? Is it permanent?
Yes.
Come in phases?
If they learn to do it, which takes about 4.5 hours of actual practice and about 10 hours of giving them space to integrate what they've just learned and then do it again, like learning to type or anything else, they can do it at any time in the future if they choose.
Bob, speaking of learning to type and so on, and the coordinated brain hemispheres, do you find any change in that kind of hand-eye coordination?
I don't know. It seems logical, but I don't have any direct experience with that. I know if the person is terribly tense and uptight, and that's causing the error signals, that the person gets relaxed and usually does better, but I wouldn't say it's actually coordination. I'd say it's removing the internal hysteria or blocks or whatever.
The question was addressed to you about inducing psychic or religious experience, and you mentioned the wave in 7.83 kilohertz.
Yes, that was 2 paragraphs in that article. We later expanded it into a report, and the report was classified, so I'm no longer at liberty to even talk about it. But I'm sure that there are thousands of people in the country that have Xerox copies of that report if you want to chase it down.
So that was 7.83 hertz rather than kilohertz, wasn't it?
7.83 hertz.